Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and to today's video where I'm going to walk you through some of the processes of drawing this beautiful puffin in coloured pencil. Before we jump in, just a quick note, the reference image I'm using for this drawing is from Pixabay and I'll leave a link in the description box if you want to check that out. And if you're interested in following along with the full tutorial in real time, you can head over to my Patreon, I've got the whole thing there for you. Okay, so let's get started. As always, I begin with the eye. If you've seen some of my videos before, you'll know that I always start with the eye because for me it gives the bird some real soul right from the beginning, and if anything goes wrong we can easily start again, because if the eye isn't right then the whole drawing will feel just off. So that is why I always start with the eye first. So I grabbed my sharp black polychromos pencil and I started to block in the centre part of the eye first, and then I drew around the outline of the actual eyeball just to give me a solid base to work from, and then I switched to my Payne's grey to lightly shade the shadowed areas of the eye. I like to play around with pressure here to create both soft shadows and some harsher contrasts, and then once that is in place I use my Luminance silver grey pencil with a slightly heavier pressure just to add those glossy highlights and define the white parts of the eye and just give the overall eyeball a little bit of a glossy look. And then to add a little bit more depth I brought in some violet grey just to give the white areas of the white eye just a little bit more colour. So the pencils I use for this drawing are the Faber-Castell Polychromos and the Caran d'Ache Luminance pencils. So next up is that pop of red around the eye, which is one of those really iconic recognisable features of the puffin. I was really careful here because it was quite a narrow area, so I used a really sharp pencil to add a little red, and then I layered in some Caput Mortuum Violet for those deeper red tones. And then a quick flick of my electric eraser really helped bring out that shine and gave it a subtle, almost wet look. It was just one of those little details that really helped to pull out the eye features. Then I moved on to the black feathers on the top of the head. This was where I took a moment to decide whether the black was warm or cool, and for this puffin I felt like it had a warm black tone because of the subtle brown hues that I could see in the lighter parts of the feathers from the reference image. So I started with a base layer of the Polychromos Warm Grey 3. I kept it light to begin with for the lighter areas on the head, and then for the darker shadows I brought in some Warm Grey 5, just keeping it light layers to begin with, and that really helps to keep things smooth. So after that I added some texture to the lighter parts of the feathers, and this is where I just added some little scribbly textures with my pencil, just adding hints of detail really. I also brought in my electric eraser just to lift out some highlights, nothing too harsh, just a few soft touches here and there just to give it a soft feathery look. So I have to admit I was a little too excited to get to the beak, so I did start working on it before the rest of the head. But honestly there is an actual benefit for doing it this way, because when it does come round to drawing the white feathers it really helps to have those surrounding dark areas in place, and that is because it simply makes it easier to judge your values and those subtle shadows in the whites. And you need that context because the shadows in the white really are quite subtle, so having those darks around your white, it does make the process 100 times easier. So I broke the beak down into parts, starting with the most prominent section. First I used some primrose for the creamy top part, and then I worked in some Warm Grey 5 for the dark tones. I also used a little Warm Grey 3 to smooth out the grey, and here is where I demonstrate something for my students on Patreon using OMS, which is odorless mineral spirits, and that blends the pigments together pretty quickly. It's just a tiny little bit of Zestit pencil blend, I'll leave the link in the description if you're interested, on a cotton bud, and it's amazing how smoothly it moves the pigment around. This is just a small demonstration though, I didn't use OMS so much else in the drawing, but it definitely gives a smoother base to work upon and it makes the layering process a lot quicker as well. So once that was all set, I started building up the colours in the beak. There's a little bit of muted purple in there, so I used some Caran d'Ache Luminance Violet Grey and some Burnt Ochre 10% to layer in those light peachy tones. I kept the pressure really light at first and then blended gently with the reds, and then I increased the pressures in some of the spots to really bring out those deeper reds, and I also added a touch of cadmium red to give it a warm glowing look. And then finally I got to the fleshy bright orange structure around the beak, another one of those prominent puffin features. I started by blocking in the creases and then just glazed over it with a couple of orange pencils to bring out those bright tones, and I just loved how it popped, especially against the dark parts of the beak. Moving on to the white feathers, and after I marked out those little creases that separated the different sections, I started with some light warm grey tones, which is basically the base layer, and this covered the white of the paper, which was super important to start with. Now I know it's surprising, but there's actually no such thing as pure white in these feathers. So what I was actually doing here was drawing the shadows of the white, and that is basically the key when drawing anything white. It's all about capturing the shadows because they are what give the white areas life and depth. So once I had that base layer down, I started to map out the general direction of the feathers. Nothing too heavy, just a few light subtle pencil strokes to block out the texture and give a hint of the feather direction. I wasn't focusing too much on it at that point, just enough to get a feel for where the feathers went. And then once I had that in place, I could really start to focus on the depth and the colour, and at that point I didn't have to worry too much about feather direction anymore. So this was where I started to apply a little bit more pressure, especially in the slightly shadowed areas. I paid close attention to the shadows around the edge of the face, and this was really important because that shadow was really prominent and really helps to give the puffin its characteristic look. So once I had that down, it was all about building up the light layers one on top of the other, and the trick here was to keep the pressure really light so that the shadows didn't get too dark. It can be really easy to accidentally make the shadows too harsh, and I definitely didn't want to muddy them up. So a light pressure to keep everything smooth and clean is definitely key in subtle shadows like this. So as I continued layering, I darkened the grey tones in the deeper shadows, mainly underneath the chin, and I really wanted those to stand out because when they're placed correctly, they do make the lighter feathers appear even brighter just by contrast. And it was all about that balance. Those dark shadows acted like a little bit of a trick of the eye, making the lighter areas look whiter. So moving on to the black feathers of the body, it's pretty similar to what I did for the head, but this time I really wanted to demonstrate how the odorless mineral spirit can speed up the process. I started by building up my base layer with a couple of dark greys, and then I applied the OMS to smooth everything out. It's amazing how much of a difference it makes depending on how much pigment you lay down. The more pigment you use, the more saturated and smooth the overall layer becomes. So once that layer had dried, I began mapping out the feather direction. I focused on creating clumps of feathers, almost like squares or linear patterns, just to establish some structure. And then after that, I went over everything with a layer of mid-tone grey, I think it was the warm grey 3, to soften those sharp lines and give the feathers a more natural, subtle appearance. So this glazing technique helps to take the edge off that linear look, and it just makes the whole thing appear a little bit more fluid. Now here I wanted to add more depth to the black feathers, so I used the point of my black pencil to go over the areas where I wanted to intensify the darkness, and then to finish up I added a few flicks of my white pencil and a blending pencil to create a softer, silkier look, and then I brought in those tiny highlights which make all the difference. I also wanted to make sure that the black and white feathers were working together and actually looked blended, so I added a few tiny lines of black that extended upwards into the white feathers, and then I used a light grey pencil to pull downwards, and this basically joined the two types of feathers together. Moving on to the white body feathers, and this part really felt like it brought everything together, especially drawing in that lovely rounded belly. I approached this a little bit differently, so rather than starting with a base layer this time, I went straight in to establish the feather direction. Since this area actually covers such a large expansive part of the drawing, I didn't want to get too overwhelmed by all that white space, so I started by applying some immediate structure. I still kept the pencil light at first because I wanted to gradually build up the depth, and then having that underlying structure really gave me something solid to work from. You can see here that I introduced a slightly darker grey, I think it's warm grey 2, maybe 3, and then because I'd started with warm greys for the feather direction, I wanted to neutralise the grey tone a little bit, so I added a layer of silver grey which has a subtle cool bluish grey undertone. The reason I did this is because I didn't want the brightest part of the belly to lean too much towards either warm or cool. I wanted it to stay pretty neutral. So mixing both warm and cool tones was exactly what I needed to balance out the shades and build up the areas, creating a little bit more of a softer, neutral type of grey. Now for the next part, the shadow of the underbelly, and because of the warmth of this shadow, this is where I start to introduce a whole rainbow of colours. So we have some peaches in there, some yellows, some browns, and even a little bit of olive green, which you'll see me use soon. So what is actually happening here is the colours from the grass which the puffin is standing on and those awesome orange feet, they're actually reflecting up onto the white glossy feathers. So in essence, I'm drawing those reflections, but in a more muted, toned down sort of way. So instead of using bright orange, I applied some peachy tones, and instead of using bright grass greens, I used some muted olive green yellowish. So I gradually built up those colours one layer at a time, making sure to incorporate some warm greys as well. The warm greys just help to stabilise and tone them down a little bit. So the key here is not to go for those bright, bold colours, as tempting as it is, but rather an earthy hint of them instead. So I only reserved a slight amount of bright orange and dark brown for the absolute deepest of those shadows, which is right underneath the belly. And those really help to pull out the shadow and make the belly look a little bit more depthy. So as I continued working on the brighter parts of the white feathers, I kept layering to build up the colours and adding small details to lift the texture. And then to finish up, I used a layer of my white Museum aquarelle pencil. Love that pencil, which not only helps to clean up the white, but it also subtly shifts the underlying tones to give them a more softer look and almost like a pastel-like appearance. Plus, it also gives the pencil texture a smoother appearance, just helps lift in some of the pencil grain. So next I moved on to the black tail feathers, and this was pretty similar to what I've already talked about before, but just with a little bit of difference here, because this is where I wanted to capture that delicate splayed-like appearance of the white feathers overlapping the black. So this involved working on both sides of the fence, so to speak. So I started by applying some sharp grey lines that fanned outwards from the white feathers towards the black, but I also made sure to mirror that approach with a sharp black pencil, pulling it in the opposite direction. So as I gradually built up the layers of black feathers and I got closer to those splayed white feathers, this is where I started to carefully push the sharp lines underneath the white. Now this can create some really bright edges that might look a little bit odd at first, so this is where the light grey pencil comes in, and it really helps to tone everything down and smooth out the brightness of those edges, just making them look a little bit less stuck on, so to speak. So to really refine and sharpen the edges even more, I use my electric eraser, just a really light touch on its sharp edge, and this allows me to bring out those fine details without overdoing it. And once I've erased, I went back in with a white pencil to clean up the lines and enhance the sharpness a little bit. And this is a tip I always go by. Whenever I use my electric eraser, I nearly always make sure to go back in with a darker pencil to clean up those edges and add back any depth that might have got lost. It's just about that back and forth process to get everything looking just right, which is often the case with coloured pencil. So finally onto those gorgeous orange feet. There wasn't too much involved here, but I wanted to make sure that they really popped. I started with a base layer of burnt ochre 10%, which is kind of a peachy tone, to start off with those lightest reflective parts of the feet first. And then from there I began building up the orange and red tones, focusing on the creases and the most prominent shapes first. I used, I think, 3 different types of reds and orange pencils, but I also incorporated some terracotta to mute the brightness down a little, and that just helped to give it a little bit more of an earthy look. So I varied my pressure as I worked, but again I kept it light and gradually building up a smooth texture. So once I had established the basic placement of the shapes, I added a little extra pressure of orange towards the end. So I really wanted to saturate that orange to make it appear bright, but obviously not too bright. I just wanted to make the feet jump out a little. And then it was just a matter of tidying up the whole drawing and working on the final tweaks and details. I really wanted this piece to feel quite deep, especially with such a large section of the white feathers, so I made sure that the shadows had plenty of depth in them. So that's something I always work on towards the end of a drawing. I work on the shadows even more just to give them extra depth. And of course I added that slightly earthy tone, which I absolutely love. So all in all, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out, and I'm kind of tempted to add some grass or grounding to the feet, so I might go and do that now. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Take care.